Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to panel discussion about the topic, role of open source in shaping the future of software development.
Hello and welcome everybody. My name is Albert and I have the experience with open source from a very interesting perspective, as I used open source for multiple big data and AI projects. So I can tell that I use like the open source technologies for the last 7 years. And it's also interesting that I did it in the industry which moved from enterprise, like a very regulated software, to the open source. And during today's discussion, we'll talk about the open source, how it reshapes and in fact how it shapes the current IT industry with people who have experience from multiple different perspectives. So now it's time to tell to our audience what is your experience with open source, and well, what do you do daily? Maik, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm Maik Wojcieszak. I'm founder of two companies. I founded one back in the 90s and consultancy in 2016. And my relationship to open source is that when I founded my first company, we used Python and many other open source projects to build software. It was a core of what we did and created value for customers. And now we develop creating cloud native applications and front ends where we use open source frameworks, open source software. So my company would not be possible without open source.
Thank you, Maik. Mario, and what is your relation with open source?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mario. I work for a company that is basically briefing open source. So we built two open core products and one open source product, but we are also heavily involved in the cloud native world. So every engineer that works in our company is contributing to at least one open source project. And the main project that we work on and we use is, you probably have heard of it, is Kubernetes. So I myself am the technical lead for the contributor communication sub-project in Kubernetes, and am part of the SIG-K8s infra. So I think we can talk about this later a bit, but the Kubernetes project is organized in special interest groups that are basically part of all the small things that are inside of Kubernetes and those SIGs, and there needs work to be done, and that's my relation to open source.
Thanks, Mario. And Nelson.
Thank you. I'm Nelson Vides. I work in Erlang Solutions. We are a consultancy around distributed scalable systems. We work mostly with Erlang and Elixir, and we are, together with Ericsson, one of the main maintainers of the very language itself, Erlang. We have plenty of open source projects that we lead. We also contribute to others like RabbitMQ. Me personally, I work specially on two open source projects, a messaging server, extensible with customizations and so on, and a load testing tool. And with that experience with these two projects and the language itself, sometimes I also manage to make some minor contributions to the language. We release from our main libraries, from our main projects, we release a lot of small libraries, also to open source. We have plenty of projects in GitHub. And most of our work is enabled by open source, and me personally, I am a huge fan of it. I love the fact that I can contribute and build a community and have a relationship with the open source community.
Thanks, Nelson. I think that we need to start with the most important question. So what kind of value is delivered by open source projects, and why companies, why we as engineers should use and also commit to open source projects? Nelson, would you like to start?
Value. Well, what can I say? As I say, that open source enables the whole thing. For example, with the language, one of the biggest non-official but still biggest contributors is WhatsApp. It's Facebook. The backend is built in Erlang, and they are beautiful contributors. They contribute so much to the whole ecosystem, because the ecosystem is what sustains their business. They earn lots of money. Facebook has relatively infinite resources, you can call it that way. And this is enabled by open source. They contribute to the language, they contribute to tooling around the language. Same thing here, like we also use tools that were created by other people that enables the job that we do. Like there are, I don't know, performance libraries, for example, for TLS implemented in native code that we use from the community to improve the performance, things like that. A lot of, particularly in my case, a lot of the work that I do starts with like consulting around an open source tool and then building customization, support, like legal liabilities, these kind of things. So
yeah. And Mario, how do you see it, especially that you work like on Kubernetes, and I think that all of us like use at least some of Kubernetes stuff.
Yeah, exactly, and I think that's the biggest point that you need to consider is that half of the internet is running on Kubernetes servers, and we basically built the Linux kernel for cloud native, more or less. And the good thing is that different companies that are normally competitors get together, work on the same project to advance the technology and work on it. And there was an interesting paper published in the beginning of the year by the Harvard Business School that basically said like how much is the worth or the value of open source, because nobody puts a price tag on open source, because how do you put a price tag on open source? People do it in their free time. People get paid for this, but they tried it. There's a method which is called Como, and you can basically take the lines in Git and the code lines and then calculate it together. Say like how much time was spent with a default engineering wage and stuff like this. And the open source value is what they calculated is $8.8 trillion. So that is how much worth is open source without change management, without any maintenance or stuff like this, just like the code that is written, which then corresponds to if any one of us is working in a company and we would need to pay for the software that we use, like programming languages, editors, things like Kubernetes, things like Docker and stuff like this, we would pay 3.5 times more than we would now pay, because it's open source and we benefit, everyone is benefiting from open source.
Mike, I'm very curious to hear your opinions. Like you founded companies, you work like daily with customers. So how do you see like value of this open source directly for your customers?
Yeah, so the value for our customers is, of course, that we can develop solutions, individual solutions faster. And it gives also another kind of opportunity to our customers, that is some kind of digital independence. So there's something called the vendor lock-in. So if you buy commercial software as a company and integrate it into your systems, and maybe the vendor loses the interest to maintain and support the solution, then you have no chance than just removing it and start from the beginning. You could develop the software your own as a company, but if you're not a software company, this might be very difficult and very expensive. So the next best thing is to join open source projects, contribute to open source projects, and integrate them into your IT infrastructure to be more independent and remove the vendor lock-in.
Okay, thank you.
If I may just add,
sure.
Take it with a pinch of salt. This is something that I read a couple of years ago, and I don't remember the exact numbers and the sources. I always like to be like very truthful too. There was some calculation about the cost of the Linux kernel if it was to be created. Like today, we just make a business and decide to implement something that does all of that. The cost surpasses the budget of defense of the US. And it's free, and it has been free for, how old is the Linux kernel? 20 years? More?
More.
Yeah. More.
I read a quote, the free in free software or in open source software is more like freedom than like free beer. So it gives you freedom to use it.
Yeah, I think that, well, you mentioned very important part, which is about like the business aspects of open source projects. And I think that during the last months, we could observe cases like changes in license of Elasticsearch, in the last time of HashiCorp, of Redis. So, well, how do you see like the business model for open source, and what should be like the way to maintain like the open source core, and also to enable, in fact, people like to have money to live and also like to commit? So Maik, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. So of course the software has to be written by people like you or other developers all over the world, and people have to be paid to make a living, and the money has to come from somewhere. So we need to think about more and more sources of money that enable developers all over the world to contribute to open source projects and to make it possible to have these high value solutions and high value software, and maintain it, support it, and write documentation for it. So a good part would be to really engage in open source project. When you're using open source project and you have the chance to contribute also with money to the project, it helps a lot.
I have a salty take on this, especially. So every employer that does software development should spend time, not money, time of each engineer, that the engineer can work on an open source project for some given amount every single week. Because every company is using open source tools on a daily basis. They make profit from it. They take, and the goal is to give back. Especially for the big projects that are around, we have like the big maintainer companies, and when we go to the contributor summit for Kubernetes, and we usually, so it's twice a year at KubeCon, and we basically do a show of hands, who of you is being paid for working on Kubernetes and who is doing it in their free time. And 80% of the people are getting paid to do this. But the problem is, these are people that are working for big companies. There's Googlers, Facebook, and the funny thing is, our company, and we are 55 people, we are #1 contributor to Kubernetes in Europe, which is hilarious. We shouldn't be. There are enough companies in Europe that has enough manpower or employees to basically surpass us in a WIMP or in any other open source project. And open source can only live if companies invest in it, because they are also reliant on it. We had the discussion before that when a CVE came out, who is fixing a CVE in an open source project? Some other person. And that's not a solution, because this could have a business impact on your environment. So you should have someone that might be able to help there.
And I think that, yeah, you talked about like critical point, right? About like this maintenance. So what kind of solution do you see? Like, and especially like, what do you think like about the last move, for example, of HashiCorp or Redis? Like, what do you think about like this license change, right? Because we could observe a lot of discussions in the internet, right? And most people weren't like satisfied with this change. And well, what do you think, what should be like this sustainable model for open source projects, and well, what is like the future for it?
Yeah, actually, like I were saying about a show of hands, and I'm curious about the public. Who has the luck to be paid to contribute to an open source project at least a couple of hours a month?
Oh, it's 4 people, 5 people.
So I think it's still quite a good result.
Somebody's doubting.
Higher than average.
Yeah. Thank you. I was going to say something, sorry, I forgot. Next one.
So I think that there's a lot of business value for companies to gain when they send people into open source, because it's also putting people learn from this. You educate your people there, and now you got your idea back. Yes.
Because you just said that every company should pay your employees to put some time, and I actually have a statement and a bit of the opposite opinion. You all know this classic problem that you have a new hire and you need to onboard it and needs to like learn your practices, your technologies, your code base versus an old employee that has an experience in the actual project. May not be like a general programming experience, but in the project, there is that years of experience in a certain project that are very valuable for a company. And for that reason, I believe if there is any manager in the room, I hope that you agree with me that all the employees are in a way more valuable than the new hire. And I think that open source has the same problem. Like I'm a complete like fan of Vim. Like I don't use any other editor. I'm like I'm young, but sometimes I look like I was born in the 80s or something. I do Tmux, Vim, everything on the shell. I don't have a UI. I don't use the mouse. I have never contributed a line of code to Vim, Neo Vim in my case. And if I was to start, there is a lot of C and Lua that I'm not familiar. Like, I think that, and I have a lot of experience in programming. I could probably get around and get to it. I think that a better, like more correct, I don't know if it's better or sustainable, but a correct model is pay the maintainer. He's the one that knows how to do things, and he's the one that is going to do a certain job in the least amount of time. If I was to fix a bug, it will take me, I don't know, a few hours, weeks of discovery, how to debug this project, how to compile it, what are the practices, then make a pull request that, and I don't know, my code style is not the usual. The maintainers know how to do it. And there is so many maintainers that there are so many projects that sustain the world, like OpenSSL or Log4j. You all have heard of this issue. There was like one guy in his garage maintaining the logger library for all of the Java world. And then suddenly the world went into madness. And there is this one guy in the garage that he's not being paid for it. I've been like scream at, hey, your software, it's vulnerable, it's crashing everything. Just pay him.
Right.
That's a statement
you put attention, I think, on a very important point, right? Because in most cases, when we talk about like contributing to open source projects, we think about directly coding. But let's be honest, there are like a lot of different ways in which we can support projects. So how do you see like way to like support projects, on a daily basis, not specifically, in fact, contributing code?
I have hopefully made a bit of advertisement on Vim. If anybody hasn't used it, please do. That's my contribution to open source.
Exactly, it's like marketing, right? And Mario, like, how do you see like these other ways to contribute?
Yeah, so we the funny thing is my Go code that I can write is shit. It's really bad, and I have never contributed a single line of code to the Kubernetes core. However, what is strange, I'm the tech lead for comms. So what does a tech lead for comms do? Oh, I do things like managing buffer. Buffer is what we use for our social media channels, because we have the Kubernetes IO Twitter account, we have the LinkedIn account, we have the mailing lists, we have the Slack bots that need to be maintained. We have a blog, we have the contributor website, we have the Kubernetes website itself, we have documentation. That has nothing to do with the core itself, but is work that is needed for the project itself. And also what you need to take care of is governance, new topics that come up, so guidelines about using AI in open source projects, project management. I mean, these are all huge projects. They need to be managed. We have, as mentioned, an infrastructure team that is just there to where do we run our builds for the next release. And these are SREs, for example. These are not like Go engineers. Why? Because SREs do the job better than a Go engineer, probably. Mm-hmm. So there's always ways to contribute. And another point that people don't do a lot is feedback. Because open source projects, if they want to go into a certain direction, like alpha features. Who of you is using Kubernetes alpha features? Oh, not so many. Who is using a beta feature? They had one or two. The problem is, when it's GA, we can't change it anymore. So if you want to have an impact, give feedback on alpha and beta features, and not like when it's GA, because when it's GA, you can't change it. Or you can change it, but the process to change it is really hard, really long, because if you change something there, you might break people, and you can't break people.
And Mike, and how do you see like this changes with open source as you are like the user and someone who is like this open source domain like for many years? And how do you see like these changes over years with open source software?
Okay, how did open source software change? So it's bigger. The projects are much bigger. Much bigger companies are contributing to huge projects like Kubernetes, or let's put the finger on it, AI. It's mainly open source, and it's really, really big. Microsoft and Google are the companies who do the big platforms like OpenAI and other things. So they invest huge amounts of money. And this has changed. When I started with open source, it was still small libraries, things that fixed small problems and which you could use. And yeah, nowadays we have a situation where there's no chance that open source can go away anymore. So if you can if you have a switch to remove open space from the world, then we don't have the internet, we don't have mobile phones, we don't have laptops or something like that. Everything is relying on open source, so it can't go away anymore. At that time when I started, it was sometimes a little bit of a curiosity universities did. So it's a great development. It's nothing bad. It's really cool because I love open source, and I like the philosophy behind open source.
And well, I think it's also like interesting to see, for example, how universities, or in fact how students, can also take advantage of open source. That's what we like discussed just before like our session. And well, how do you see like this capability also for treating like this open source projects as a kind of like entry point for next generation of engineers? How do you see it, Nelson?
Entry points for new generations of...
Yes.
I think we were talking about that before. Universities are a great pool of labor, so to call it somehow. Like there is lots of students that want to make a portfolio, you know, a career. So
I think portfolio is better.
Yeah. That's a very common pattern. Like you collaborate with a university, you get a few students, you guide them, and they start contributing to some tooling, documentation, for example, and it's a good entry point for the developer and for the tool that they are contributing to.
And well, which industries have you observed as the one which profits the most from open source? Like, do you see like a specific industry which is, you know, like which in fact relies on open source? Do you have like some examples?
I'm trying to think, is there any industry that doesn't?
That's also like a good point. And I think that, well, we can also think about like, we can talk about like the case which is about in fact providing managed open source projects, like something that is like behind the reason why, for example, Redis changed their license, right? That, for example, some major cloud providers provided Redis as a service, like without in fact contributing or paying like enough fees. And well, how do you see like this license change, or how do you see like this fight between like the biggest IT companies and in fact, well, open source projects or open source teams?
I like the example of Docker from a couple of years ago. Like, who doesn't use Docker? Like, quite a universal tool these days, and they are doing an amazing job at doing something that we all use daily, and it powers all of our business more or less. And it was free, and now they changed this license that only when your company is more than, not sure, like 100 people or makes more than $1 million a year, something like that, then you need to pay. It's a fair license. You get like a free room for all the students and the open source projects and like the freelancers, the startups. But once you make profit, like you have made profit because someone else did something for you. So pay back.
Right.
I mean, I have also a salty take on this. So I like open source projects that are not maintained by a company, that are maintained by a non-profit organization. That's also the point what Apache Foundation did long years ago. Right. They started with it. Linux Foundation was then founded, and CNCF is part of the Linux Foundation, and basically projects are then owned by the foundation and not by a company. Mm-hmm. And there's also like the government's thing that you need to have at least 2 or 3 companies that say they will sponsor a project into a foundation, so that mm-hmm. It's always overruled, so that not a single company can take advantage like HashiCorp did with Terraform, because HashiCorp owned Terraform because they created it, they open sourced it in some kind of way. And the problem, for example, there was that a ton of issues or a ton of PRs with features that were not like considered valuable for HashiCorp because it would go against their business value, like encryption for credentials in the Terraform apply process. Yeah, they wanted you to use Vault so that you mm-hmm. pay for Vault. I can understand this. This would have never happened if it would be on a governance board that was maintained by different companies. And my take is that open source projects that are maintained by a single company always fall in the risk to this mm-hmm. license changes, as we saw with Redis, Elastic, Terraform, I don't know, a ton of projects. And also what was strange mm-hmm. about these things was, HashiCorp announced that there are plans that they're getting acquired, like 3 months after the license change. Who would think why they did the license change? What their motivation was? Of course, to bring up more revenue and to have the product in by themselves. So I'm strictly voting for putting open source projects in foundations. But Mike, you also have a take on this, I guess.
Sure, thank you. So why not using open source? So open source was invented at MIT initially as a way to manage software projects. And currently we have a situation with digitization of companies who were not classically IT companies or software companies. They need more and more software. So these companies also have the chance to maybe collaborate and create open source software, sponsor the open source software, and use this way of creating new software to get what they need to be successful in digitization and creating new business models.
And well, we mentioned like about this importance of open source, like for all kind of companies. Like it doesn't matter whether we talk about small, big companies and in what industry. And how do you see like the importance of community, right? So like the group of users, what should be like the perfect community of open source projects, right? Because like based on my experience, when I work with all of this, like Apache Hadoop, Apache Spark, Kafka Flink, it was always about the community, as community like opened discussions. And in most cases, in fact, like especially I think in this like data market, before most companies moved to the cloud, in fact, it was like the only way to find some workarounds or solutions. And how do you see like this importance of community, and what should be like the perfect community of open source? Mario, as you work like on this com, I think you have also a salty take.
In my opinion, the open source community, especially for maintainers in projects, is the most welcoming and most friendly community that you can find on the world, because there are no borders, there are nearly no language barriers, more or less, and we can make it work usually. It's people work together on a common goal, which makes them all nice. There's always there should be a code of conduct in place. Mm-hmm. That's a main given, because you always find the troll, and as we all know, don't feed the troll. and there's always someone salty. Tim Hawkin and Dims, two of the main maintainers of Kubernetes, had a nice talk about this. Kubernetes maintainers read mean tweets against maintainers, where they just went through issues where people just commented like, "This is shit in Kubernetes. Why did you do this? Or why is the issue still open for half a year? What do you even do?" and something like this. And for us, it was great because it was the fuel for them for a talk. But internally, inside of the community, if you're willing to invest some time, and if people see that you're willing to invest time, they do everything to mentor you. And then if we go back to the student topic that we had before, where we said like, why is open source good for students? Because you're building basically a CV, and there's no one that I ever encountered that said, I won't help you to get onboarded into the project where you can get some help. So we have, for example, we have shadow programs where people just can follow along and see what other people do. And then they learn new skills inside of the open source project. And they then also they make contacts. That's the most important thing, because I had a couple of folks that were laid off in the past half year, and they said like, yeah, I know a company they are hiring. I know a company there's hiring, because you know people from all over the world in different companies that are maybe your next employer will be, and it's easy for you to join because you already have a personal reference, because you know someone that knows you. You also have a CV that is in GitHub that everyone can see, and you can prove that, because everything is recorded and put online, because everything is open source. You can just say like, hey, this is how I work. This is the way how I work. And so basically, they already have an interview. The first 3 rounds of an interview process are already done, more or less, because of your references.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting.
Like the idea of the CV in GitHub, and I don't know when they added that, but I only noticed recently that, you know, when you get your profile and you see like your commit history and you get these funny graphs and so on, it also can show commits to private repositories, and it doesn't say the name, but it says like a parenthesis, and there's activity on private repositories, which is sometimes the job that you cannot share because it's private. There is an IP on that, but it shows that you were active in this period. You really build a history. You build your CV there, and then you also build your best practices, your opinions on the pull request reviews. I hope that every single pull request is reviewed. I hope we don't have to discuss that.
Of course.
I have a story about this, but yeah, go ahead.
No, that's all. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it's time for a story.
So we had an offsite last week where our company got together and we had a hackathon, and there was the Go Build tool that you can use to run Go builds. And one of the maintainers made a commit, self-approved the PR, and merged it, which basically was like adding verbose to the output of the build process. So all of the keys and certificates were just in the log, and when you had it in the public, so we immediately filled the security notification, and they patched it. So we wrote just the PR that was self-approved. But things happen. If you give people power, they might do. This was the Friday evening. It's 8 p.m. and it's a push into production thing.
I think it's a starter pack. It's a starter pack for success in IT. Friday evening and self-approved PR.
I once pushed to production on a Friday evening before Christmas. But nothing happened. I have no funny story to tell, but I was very nervous about it.
Yeah, like, what is your experience like with like open source, and what is, like, in your opinion, like the most valuable open source projects in the world? As currently, well, we rely on the open source like operating systems. We have programming languages. And I think that in many cases, well, we forget that, well, it's in many cases like open source. So what do you see like as one of the most, like, valuable open source project?
I'm going to mention Vim for a third time. No, but apart from that, like obviously the kernel. You were saying before about using alpha features and so on, and I remember when I started programming and I was very excited, and Linux, and I was learning the shell, and I decided to enable night builds for my kernel. It was so unstable. I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course, but you get to remember all the times it broke, and in retrospect, it felt like a lot. Of course, my computer was working, but I at the beginning, I was also like trying to join the mailing list and say, "Hey, this broke for me." It's quite a big community. That was years ago. Now I'm a great fan of Vim, Tmux, Firefox. Those are like 3 communities that I try to like also send my opinion. Programming languages, like of course that's my actual job is that one. Yeah.
I mean, I would personally go for Kubernetes, but the most valued open source projects in the world are the programming languages. They make up, this was also in the paper that I mentioned, they make up 84% of the amount of money it would cost to build them. So the languages are the biggest project.
Yeah, I had the chance to work with students 2 years ago or so, and to teach them a little bit of open source, and they needed to contribute to an open source project to get their grade. And I saw that they really liked the social projects where software was used to fix or reduce social problems and help to communicate or help to educate people and so on. So I really like these projects, and I think they play a very important role in our society.
Thank you, guys. So
what is your most favorite project?
Honestly, as I think Apache Kafka is still like the one software which I used in so many projects across so many industries. You know, like in most cases, like the case like with Kafka, it's like for example, like with Kerberos, right? You can also find a great Git book, Kerberos Beyond like the Gate of Madness, because it's like very tough to configure. Let's be honest, but when you are able to configure it properly, it matches all requirements. I think that's like the projects which I do like the most because I use it like the most. And I think the second one is like still like Kubernetes, as everyone uses it. Like that's like the something that powers. And except like programming languages, these are like the fundamental thing. Everything. I think we can jump into questions as we do not have.
I wanted to mention a little story. I was actually recent, like a month ago, in my team. We were discussing alternatives for the terminal emulator. I started the discussion, the one that we were using, I don't want to give names to advertise or disadvertise. The one that I was using was not GPU accelerated, so sometimes on drawing, and I was like, I'm going to look for some other. And then I started the discussion with my team, and we found it was easy to find alternatives. But there was one that looked amazing, like had all the features you could expect, performance was just incredible, but it was not open source. And I remember in my team, most of the people, there was one guy saying, no, we cannot have a terminal that is not open source. It's like the most critical thing, together with the kernel and I don't know, your programming language and your browser. How do you know? And that's also a thing that I like in favor of open source. Not open source project, how do you know that they are not doing something under the hood, that God knows what it is? Like, or even maybe it's not like for malicious intentions. We all heard like something like 15 years ago there was this scandal with Prism and all of that. Maybe let's forget about like a malicious intentions, a mistake. Like people can just make a programmer had a bad night, slept bad, and just a typo, and there is a bug. In open source there is thousands of eyes looking at that code. In closed source there is just a few. So I think that's those kind of pieces that are very critical, like a kernel or a terminal emulator, the programming language. I think it's healthy that they are very carefully looked at by as much people as possible.
Yeah, I think it's also like security aspect is like critical also for open source in many cases.
Yeah,
so.
Of course. Then we have issues because I saw one.
Yes, yeah. So let's start. So yeah, can we like present question? Okay, Nelson, I can see.
So you can read there.
Yeah, but I almost can't see. I'm sitting too much closer to monitor.
What can you do to prevent security breaches using open source products? Recently, a dev in big tech accidentally found malicious code and prevented a disaster.
Yeah. Questions later was the name of the code that is the XZ library.
Yeah, and I think that it's exactly like with closed source software, right? In most cases, we need like to provide tests and like to implement like this shift left approach. And well, it's like always the part of like any kind of engineering domain, right? That there will be like some bugs, issues, and well, we need to improve process.
I mean, that's the most important thing. Processes. There's, for example, again, Kubernetes. I'm sorry, I'm boring you. We have a SIG that is purely there to check updates for reliant projects. Like I know a new Go version has come out and stuff like this. So that's purely there to update dependencies and fix them. And there was a CVE a couple of weeks ago in Containerd, or it affected Containerd. The problem was that it was then shipped with Kubernetes and stuff like this. And I think it took 24 hours to fix the CVE, fix the Containerd version, fix the Kubernetes version, publish it. The major cloud providers provided a patch and implemented the patch version. And I think only one operating system that was not even affected took some time to patch it, because the problem is also with security breaches is we have CVEs, which is fine, but a CVE might not affect you, because a CVE first and foremost is we have a security issue, but it does not mean that it is exploitable. It does not mean that it is imminent. For example, the Linux team changed, I think 2 or 3 days ago, their procedure that bug fixes are retrospectively added as CVEs, which is, in my opinion, not a great idea, because it will inflate the CVE process and CVEs, and it won't affect you anymore because it's already fixed. CVEs need to be considered in some way if they really affect you.